camera set up, and did you get the guests?
The Progressive Radio Network exists because this is the one forum that brings
the camera's recording, it's ready to go, and I'm calling you guys right now.
Creative and dynamic minds on the planet.
We're good to go.
Join us each and every day, 24/7,
Hi, Meg.
on the Progressive Radio Network. Your home.
Hi, Jim. This is Katie calling from Progressive Radio Network. How are you? Mitch is going to get started really shortly, so I'm going to put you on hold, and he will be right with you, okay? His show's from 6 to 7, so probably around an hour. Okay? All right, thanks so much.
Into religious and spiritual practices around the world every Sunday, 2 to 3 p.m. Eastern Standard Time on the Progressive Radio Network.
You're listening to the Progressive Radio Network, your number one source for progressive commentary.
Welcome back to A Better World. This is your host, Mitchell J. Rabin. I'm very glad you're joining us again today on the Progressive Radio Network. And of all days, we are broadcasting on Passover. Why on this day? Well, because it's important to couples who from Egypt, say that's being described from the lower chakra, our lower nature, which is what our prayer. So something that Jim, are you on the phone? Yeah. Excellent. What a pleasure to have you on the show. Thank you so much. Happy Passover. Well, thank you very much. To you as well. So this makes it a greater honor that we would convene on such a holy day. Let us see now. I wanted to ask you, because after reading this, I realized that sometimes I'm very reverent, and sometimes I want to balance that out with some irreverence. And as I read your background, having essentially a master's in Christology, I was wondering, it sounds like an academic study of Jesus Christ, and that seemed a little oxymoron.
Karen, this is
Can
Katie.
you first tell us a little bit about that?
Good, how are you?
Well, if you think about Jesus of Nazareth, probably no one, certainly in Western civilization, would have made his mark or even a
Oh, okay, let me see if I can fix it. Thank you so much for calling us, okay? Right, good. Where's
that
Jason?
seemed to me to be
I don't know.
an appropriate
Jason?
area to attend in the kind of
Juice?
Yeah.
play
It's okay, thanks.
who was in nature, of his divinity or not.
You don't want it?
So that
You can have both.
balance
Thank you. Are you leaving?
Yeah, see you later.
Have a good night. Jason, how do I get the audio in here? Where do I plug it in? At the headphones, right? Got unplugged. I think this is fine now. It was just got unplugged. So now it should be... Oh, well, now it's like showing up.
It was worth some time in an institution like Harvard to really explore, the phenomenon of Jesus of Nazareth. And,
Indeed.
So that's what
that is.
That's what I remember. I had an experience once where I was going driving to Northeast Washington. And this is before, and one of the reasons why I ended up going to the Divinity School to study Christology within the context of the history of world religions.
Mm-hmm.
I was driving to the Jesuit house where I was staying, and I was passing the National Cathedral, and way up on the top of the spire there was a blue light. And all of a sudden it struck me, that I was passing a mausoleum to a man that had died 2,000 years ago, and I actually stopped the car, and I thought about it for a long time. An academic study seemed to me for 2 years worth the time.
I understand. After all, to have history defined essentially by your birth is not a small mark on history at all.
No, it's not.
I mean, it doesn't really get much larger. I'm pressed about that one for sure. It's just funny because historically, and please, since we're on this, why don't we take a moment, because it's always been so interesting to me. I feel a deep kinship with him. The Christian religion was started in his name, but not by him, as far as I know. And also, as far as I know, the first extant text we have referencing Jesus Christ is Josephus from Roman times, which is
That's
a good
correct.
Some almost 200 years after he's said to have lived. Could you comment on that?
Well, no, Josephus was in the 70s, so it was
70s.
about,
Excuse me. Within 100 years.
after.
Yeah.
With about 40 years. Oh, no, that's absolutely correct. It's worth mentioning that the only major world religious figure that was born in the full light of history was Muhammad. Jesus, Moses, Abraham, Buddha, Mahavira,
Lao Tzu.
Confucius, Lao Tzu, all were born, lived, and died shrouded in mystery.
Yes.
And in the case of the Buddha, it was centuries before things were written down. Lao Tzu remains to this day shrouded in mystery.
Very true. Some doubt whether he ever lived.
That's exactly right. So, speaking of Passover, there is absolutely no historical evidence at all, not a shred, that the Exodus ever happened or that Moses ever lived. And were it not for Torah,
yes,
there would probably be no memory at all. And it really begs the question: what determines reality? Is the reality of the memory in the Jewish collective psyche sufficient to determine, historical certitude? Is a potsherd, in an archaeological dig that has sort of Jesus Christ in Greek, does that count? I mean,
these are very good questions. Yeah.
I was just in Haran and Urfa in Turkey, and there's supposed to be the cave where Abraham was born.
Yes.
And did it really happen there? I mean, there's many questions about these great historical figures. By the way, I just have always felt that the greatest mistake that the Jews made was in letting Jesus slip out and get captured by the Christians. And I mean this both humorously but seriously. I think that for Jesus to be captured by the Christians was a historic mistake for which we have paid dearly and are paying very dearly today. I think the power that he represented needed to have been curated within an old culture where wisdom was beginning to take hold. And I think the Jews quibbled with him for ultimately small reasons. And had they honored him as they did some of their prophets, not many, but some of their prophets during their lifetimes, I think history would have turned out completely differently, and I think more powerfully, sagaciously, and I think with greater humility.
Oh, that was beautifully put. I agree with you, Jim. In fact, you are reminding me of my own Jewish Taiji Chuan teacher down in New York City's Chinatown on the Bowery, who many years ago said that the Jews missed Jesus. They missed the true Messiah. Of course, in Hebrew, Moshiach, the king, doesn't mean some being descending from the clouds. It's the king of men is really what it signifies. And that had the Sanhedrin at the time recognized Jesus for being who he was, because they were always on the search for a Messiah, had they recognized that in him, because he certainly fit the criteria, and they have criteria like a legal document of who fits the requirements and conditions of a Messiah. If they had recognized him, yes, history would have fleshed out entirely differently, which is in effect the point you're making. Are you there?
Yes.
I'm essentially corroborating from another point of view the same notion that history would have shown itself to be very different. We would have been on a very different tack if the rabbinical court, the Sanhedrin, would have recognized Jesus Christ as the Messiah. And I don't mean to make that sound overly weighty in the way the, let's say, Christian right describes it today, but rather Messiah as in Hebrew Moshiach, meaning king as in king of men.
Well, I think it's worth thinking through for a moment here, probably other things we need to discuss, but I think that it's not altogether clear that Jesus himself felt that he was a Messiah. I think that the
Right.
dialectical tension that occurred between Jesus and the Pharisees and the Sadducees at the time was of a more doctrinal nature, and the latitude that the Orthodox Jews were willing to give to a man who was reinterpreting Torah in light of the command to love your neighbor.
Mm-hmm.
And, I think, is it a sin to do good on the Sabbath? Well, that's ultimately a quibble. That's not really a debate over which you start to conspire with the Roman overlords to crucify this man.
Correct.
And I think had there been a genuine willingness on the part of the Jewish hierarchy to engage with him in a serious manner, I think he would have infused new life into Judaism right at a moment when it really needed it, and we could have avoided this entire, I think, ultimately spurious discussion about whether he was God or not God, or the Messiah or not God. I don't think he had any pretenses to be. I think that was something that emerged in the mind of those who had other motives at heart, much more having to do with the acquisition of power.
Yes, economics and politics.
Yeah.
I would agree with you completely. Well, actually, that last point, Jim, bears some relevance to a direction that I would like to steer this discussion. I just want to say, relative to your experience recently in Turkey, exploring that cave said to be the place, do you say, of Abraham's birth?
Yeah.
Is that what you said? I was just some months back in an area of China said to be the place of Lao Tzu's ascension. So, life is
even
fun.
A little plaque where they say that Abraham realized monotheism.
That's wonderful. It
X
should
marks the spot.
That marks the spot, right? It should be commemorated. So to bring this idea of power brokering forward, because of a lot of your work, America as Empire, and subsequent work that you have spent a lot of time at over the course of your professional life, I'd like to speak about this whole idea of power brokers, especially in today's world where there's becoming greater transparency. Thank goodness the veil is being lifted. But I would like to hear what you have to say about really the exchange of and negotiation of power. After all, you have been quite close to Mikhail Gorbachev for many years. You were serving as president of the State of the World Forum in conjunction with him. Could you speak a little bit about what it is you see, and then we'll go from there into where do you think we're going?
Well, I mean, I think that the situation in the world today, I think, is one of very grim portent. And what I mean by that is that I think that after, 4 or 5 centuries now of the Industrial Revolution, we're putting so much carbon dioxide into the atmosphere that at a rate of about 100 million tons every 24 hours, that we're radically destabilizing the atmosphere through global warming. And we are changing the pH content of the oceans, which absorb 40% of the CO2 that we put up into the atmosphere. It goes into the oceans as well as into the atmosphere itself.
It's acidifying.
And I think that in terms of power, what we have is the American imperium at its last stages of ossification, where what you have taking place in the world right now is a classic example of an imperial structure in radical decline.
A la Rome.
Well, yes. I mean, just looking at it from a kind of a categorical point of view, if you look at any history of the rise and fall of empires, there's what historians call the imperial arc. Empires rise, they hold power for a certain period of time, and then they fall. There are no exceptions. So the only question that an empire has once it's reached its apogee moment is how long it's going to endure before it falls. And if you look back over history, empires...
Are you referring to the work of Arnold Toynbee?
Oh, yeah. I mean, if you look at his study of history, he...
Okay. Jim will be back momentarily. Interesting. So it's the rate of decline, not whether there will be a decline, Jim is saying, but what is the rate of decline? Let me inform you all that you are listening to Mitchell J. Rabin on A Better World on Progressive Radio Network. You can always reach us at our website at www.abetterworld.net, where we are building a community of like-minded, and not always like-minded, but people who care about the world, who care about the earth, and want to make a difference. They want to get educated, and they want to participate. That's what A Better World is largely about, to educate, uplift, and inspire. So please become part of our world at A Better World. Again, that's www.abetterworld.net. We are just bringing Jim back. Katie is hard at work at it, and he'll be with us in a moment, but this is a little station identification. So, Jim, as you were saying...
Well, I mean...
It was the rate of decline. Essentially, what we're looking at, what distinguishes one falling civilization, to use the word rather loosely, or another, is the rate of its decline after its apogee.
Right, and... So if you look at what the United States, well, let's back up a moment, because this is a very important point for every single citizen of the United States. What was the difference between, say, the Nazis, whose imperial thrust lasted 12 years till Hitler blew his brains out on April 30th, 1945, and Rome, which... lasted well over 1,000 years in terms of its imperial sway. The Nazis concentrated all their imperial might in the army. And what Rome did is they concentrated their imperial might in two ways. One, they had their legions, but they also built institutions that the conquered people fundamentally experienced as fair. There was one point in the Roman Empire in the 2nd century A.D. where one could travel from England to Germany to Spain, along North Africa, into the Eastern Mediterranean with one law, one language, and one coinage. That's a feat that has never been replicated even to the present day.
Yes.
And so it was the genius of the Romans was in building institutions that were experienced as fundamentally fair. Now, if you look at
and people and public serving.
Yeah. In the New Testament, for example, there's the story of Paul being beaten and saying to the Roman centurion, listen, you can't do this. Here's my papers as a Roman citizen. I appeal to Caesar. And the Roman centurion in Syria had to take a completely anonymous man all the way to Rome because he demanded it as a Roman citizen. That's an extraordinary legal system that would sanction that.
Yes.
Now, if you look back over the last 75 years in the United States, you see a perfect example of an imperium in ascendancy and decline. Look what Roosevelt did. As the United States came out of the Great Depression, what did he do in the New Deal? He built the institutions that created the basis of the American strength at home, with Social Security, the reform of Wall Street, all the major institutions.
The TVA.
All of it. TVA, everything.
Yep.
He built institutions. Then, with the Second World War and in its aftermath, almost every major international institution, from the United Nations to the IMF, the World Bank, the GATT, the International Airport coordinations and associations, etc., were all built under the aegis of American kind of imperial power. We had our legions around the world.
Supremacy.
But we're building institutions that, like the United Nations, that the world fundamentally experiences as fair.
Yes.
But look what's happened under Bush and now under Obama. It is the complete dismantling of the institutions inside the United States that have protected the American poor and the American middle class. There is the dismantling abroad, particularly under the Bush administration, of almost every international institution that American power under Roosevelt and Truman lifted up.
Exactly, like the Geneva Convention.
Pardon?
Like the Geneva Conventions.
Yeah, exactly. So what you have in the United States today is imperial overreach abroad, accentuating military supremacy and the gutting of international institutions that we consider to be an impediment to the full scope of our military projections. And then internally, we're literally gutting Medicare, we're gutting Social Security, we're gutting the capacity of the middle class to live normal lives with the subprime mortgage scam.
Correct.
We're gutting the capacity of Americans to own their own homes. So what do you have? You have that classic situation that Toynbee says is the critical ingredient before the fall. The United States is now losing all its elasticity. It's overextended abroad. It is now completely hollowed out internally. And in fact, the S&P today lowered the U.S. credit rating.
Did it really?
From stable to negative, even though it kept its AAA rating. It's basically saying that because of the indebtedness of the United States, we have a negative long-term future. That's the S&P. I mean, this is like Standard & Poor's. This is the United States downgrading itself.
Exactly. It's a venerable American institution.
Exactly.
With a vested interest in our supremacy.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. But so egregious have we become internationally and disengaged. I mean, we don't have politics in this country anymore. We have madness.
Yes.
What's going on in Washington right now between Barack Obama, who's got to be the biggest disappointment in modern American history, and the Republicans, who have now gone into the lunatic right-wing fringe, is a madness has descended upon the nation. And if you read Gibbon's Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, you look back over history, you say, how are these people so stupid?
Yes.
Well, look at the news in the United States today.
Yes.
You say, how are these guys, how can they gut Social Security?
Medicare,
how could they gut Medicare? How could they, in the face of what's happening, how could they continue to lower the corporate taxes and the taxes of the richest of the rich? I mean,
even against the protest of the super wealthy, many of whom have come out publicly and said, we don't even want these because they make no difference in our lives. Warren Buffett, Bill Gates, and others. Right?
Totally.
Yeah. This is what we're dealing with.
And meanwhile, our military expenditures have grown 81% in the last 10 years, and they continue to escalate.
Yes.
And we are now not only content to be in Iraq, and the Secretary of Defense Gates has indicated that we want to stay there now indefinitely.
Correct.
and that we're in Afghanistan, we're now diving into Libya.
Exactly.
As if...
I have a question behind all of this. You're making excellent points, Jim, all of which I totally appreciate and am on board with, and I make them in my own newsletters and broadcast routinely in different respects. What is, and you say mad, and it's true, I call this, among other things, the pathology of the affluent. And yet there has to be a way around this. I mean, look at Walker in Wisconsin. Look at Ryan in Congress. This, as you say, is a lunatic fringe. Who do they represent? And how are they really getting, besides the Koch brothers, and how are they really getting away with it? More than anything, what is the solution? I appreciate the historical perspective tremendously, and we have so much to learn from it. What can we, as Americans, and altogether largely humans, do at this point in time?
Well, this may be a bit controversial, but I personally believe that we have passed the point of no return. And let me unpack that for a moment.
That's
I
very
believe
powerful.
that the administration of Barack Obama was the last moment that America had to redeem itself. And I think that, as you remember, in 2008, Barack Obama rose up. We discarded Hillary Clinton, who was the obvious choice. We opted as Democrats for the audacity of hope. And everybody in the United States, I think, knew that radical social and political transformation was needed after 8 years of the egregious politics of George Bush and the deceptions and the lies and the corruption of the American spirit at the hands of George Bush.
True.
And, in fact, the world was so enthusiastic that they basically awarded him the Nobel Peace Prize before he even took office. Such was the expectation of a Rooseveltian transformation of politics in America, and the fact that Barack Obama completely surrendered to the vested interests, sold out to Wall Street, sold out to the military, sold out basically to the vested interests, and has not had a shred of any really meaningful reform, particularly on climate change or financial reform. I think from a historical, psycho-historical point of view is the reason why we've gotten the Tea Party.
Yes.
You know, when history zigs and it should have zagged, it causes a consternation in the polity. I mean, look at all the frustration on the progressive left. Look at the frustration on the right. There's now consternation in the land, and I think it's due ultimately.
Oh, for some reason we're having some technical challenges here. But let me remind you all that you are listening to Mitchell J. Rabin on A Better World with our guest today, Jim Garrison. He's the president of Wisdom University and with a distinguished background in so many areas that have all, as you can tell, aggregate into a very learned gentleman with some very strong perspectives and outlining an historical perspective for us all, tracing the movements of empires that follow a certain historical cycle. And that's where we are right now, looking at the Obama administration as, you could almost say, the last hurrah, the last choice, the last chance. He is saying, rather controversially, it's true, that America would have had to, would you say, redeem itself. Please go on, Jim.
Yeah, so, you know, when choices are made in one's personal life and when choices are made in history, you can't make a choice, make a decision, and go down the road and say, oh, wait a minute, I want to change my mind.
Right.
That's not the way the universe is constructed, and I think the demise of Barack Obama is going to now condemn. He may squeak. I don't think he deserves a second term. He may squeak by, but I think at least until 2016 now, the United States is going to be condemned to the politics of paralysis precisely at the moment when the world and the United States needed a new Roosevelt.
Yes.
It needs a decisive, visionary, transformational leader. So I think that when I say we've passed the point of no return, I think that what is now inevitable is a cascade of crises that are going to emerge probably out of the climate and the ecology that are going to devastate the United States and increasingly devastate the world, just like the earthquake, tsunami, and meltdown is currently devastating Japan. You know, in the last 25 years, the number of extreme weather events has quadrupled.
Greatly
and
accelerated.
That's what global warming and climate change means.
That's
right. In effect, climate change is turning into climate shock.
Mm-hmm.
And in the face of that, every government in the world, led by the United States, is refusing to take any decisive action.
That's correct.
So the situation objectively is getting worse and worse. And meanwhile, all the U.S. government can do, like as you're seeing in Wisconsin, is hollow out the capacity of ordinary people to lead meaningful lives, break the unions, destroy Social Security and Medicare in this delusional politics called deficit reduction.
It's interesting, Jim, that the Republicans, while I am so not interested in the polarity between these two, and I generally endorse Ralph Nader's perspective of twiddly-dee and twiddly-dum, you can hardly tell the difference between them. But now, because of this polarity around the budget issues and the union issues, there actually is a rather stark polarity going on that we're facing. Nonetheless, I like to tell my audience that I was not for an Obama White House. I was for a Dennis Kucinich White House, coupled with, interestingly, controversially, Ron Paul. And I had a very, exactly, you got it. I had a very I feel noble psychological impetus toward that, because I don't like blue, I don't like red, I wanted purple, and I wanted to create symmetry from lateralization in the global American mind and melt those differences of Democrat and Republican into one single administration. I thought you'd appreciate that. But here we really are moving along a certain axis, if you will, which is suggesting that the politics of people, devastating and grim as you're making it clear that it is, I truly believe it is going to be really subordinated to a much larger picture having to do with our relationship to the earth herself. And I know that's a lot of the work you do at Wisdom University, and I believe is hinted in the title of your upcoming book, Climate Change in the Primordial Mind. And I get a sense that there is an indigenous wisdom that you are beginning to call forth that goes far beyond our absurd pathological politics and sense of self-importance, and a return, if you will, coupled with our current intelligence and technology and all of that, to come to another relationship altogether relative to our stewardship, something that I've been calling, and is a chapter in my book, called Sacred Stewardship, which I feel is the direction we must go in, and all world politics, all human activity will become subordinate to.
Absolutely.
Your comments?
Yeah, well, I think there's a couple of points. One is that I think, as you no doubt have been talking in terms of various programs that you've had, the issue of global warming and climate change is the human issue confronting the human race, in the face of which every other issue is marginal.
True.
I mean, we now have increased global temperatures over 1.5 degrees Fahrenheit. And so we've literally given the Earth a fever. You know, if you or I had a temperature right now of about 1.8 degrees Fahrenheit, we probably wouldn't be on this call.
Very true.
And so the Earth is reacting just like the oceans are, in a very kind of increasingly turbulent way. I mentioned the quadrupling of the number of extreme weather events. Another issue is the beginning of the rise of the sea levels.
Yes.
You know, if all the ice melted off of the two poles, the Antarctic and the Arctic and Greenland, sea levels would go up between 75 and 100 meters. So government scientists are beginning to predict that by 2050, we're going to get sea level rises around the United States of at least 6 inches. So just imagine for a moment what it would mean if all the coastal cities on the west and east coast begin to be flooded.
Yes.
And where would those people, where would the 20 million people in metropolitan New York go? San Francisco, Los Angeles, San Diego, Houston,
Washington,
Miami, etc. There's 181 major cities around the United States coasts that comprise well over 50% of the U.S. population. So we're looking at basically the collapse of civilization as we know it. And if in the face of that you've gutted all your social welfare agencies, you have, going back to Toynbee, no elasticity left.
Yes.
And so this is a serious issue. Now, the second point that I think, again, as difficult as it is, must be made is basically the issue that we've passed the point of no return. There's now so much CO2 being generated. The governments of the world have been so negligent in their responses that the amount of CO2 that's already in the atmosphere, well over 1.5 trillion tons, is causing the turbulence that we're experiencing today. And even if we stopped tomorrow morning, you would still have a rising crescendo of extreme weather events and earthquakes. There was a report just released 2 days ago saying that the climate change now is being associated with earthquakes, because when you have a fever in your body, everything starts to kind of tremble, and including the tectonic plates.
Yes.
And so we have to really get serious as human beings. That I believe that James Lovelock's prediction, he wrote the book Gaia, and is responsible for the Gaia hypothesis, now the Gaia theory. And he probably knows more about climate change than anyone I personally know, having studied the Earth's ecology, the atmosphere in particular, and also the oceans. And he predicts that if current trends continue, and no one, whether Barack Obama or President Hu in China or Sarkozy in France, there's not a single major world leader on the stage today that's doing really anything to stop the radical increase in our CO2 emissions. He believes that by 2100, roughly 80% of the human race will have been killed off or have died off by 3 interrelated factors. 1, climate catastrophes. 2, the spread of infectious diseases. And 3, the conflicts and wars that will ensue because of the massive migrations of people. And
the demand for water.
And the demand for water, absolutely. The Ogallala aquifer under, most of the Midwest and Texas is about 95% depleted.
Oh my God!
And so we need to really internalize that we are facing a catastrophic system failure
completely,
and that we need, therefore, to answer your earlier question, it's no longer to me sufficient to try to lobby your congressman, because the Congress on both sides of the aisle, including the presidency, have basically been bought out by the financial interests. And I would recommend that anybody doesn't either, if you don't understand or agree with that, go see the movie Inside Job, which just lays out in a single documentary that got the Academy Award this last year.
It sure did.
What it means when you say that the financial interests have bought out the government of the United States. We've essentially had a coup.
Yes.
And it wasn't a military putsch like in the 30s or the overthrow of one party by another. It was the buying out by Wall Street of the two major parties in the United States and the presidency.
Exactly.
And so elections continue to happen, but it doesn't make any difference because everyone's basically sold their souls, with very, very few exceptions.
Very true.
And so...
And very little way to make a structural change.
Exactly.
Because it's all paid for by Goldman Sachs and Brothers.
Yeah, that's exactly right. So what can one do? I believe that the only thing realistic to be done under current circumstances is to build resilient community.
Yes.
And let me give you a historical... I know we're running up against the hour, and I apologize. My phone has died. I don't know what the problem has been, but let me give you a historical analogy.
I'm glad you came
here.
back. Please do. Right at the moment of a historical analogy, which will really help us come to greater grip with this truly devastating situation that you regular listeners know we address routinely, not as articulately as Jim Garrison is doing here today, but certainly richly, and I would dare say poignantly. Why? Because we must face these deep issues. We must. Oh, I dance around the edges of them with a little lightness and humor, and I think about Robin Williams' great line of what we're facing here is not global warming, but global grilling. And I personally think humor is one of the chief ways we're going to wiggle out of the situation, because sobriety doesn't really seem to do it. Jim, please continue with that poignant comment.
So, Saint Benedict, who founded the Benedictine order, looked at the situation of the fall of Rome, and he realized, with the barbarians on the frontier, that the projection of civility and morality on the imperial institutions was a mistake, and so he founded the Benedictine order as an attempt to build resilient community in the face of the decline of the imperium. The major difference between Rome then and Saint Benedict then and our situation now is he saw the barbarians on the frontier. We have been ruled by the barbarians for some time.
Yes.
And it's our lack of appreciation of that really constitutes the major part of our predicament. So what Wisdom University is doing, and what I've been spending much of my time doing, is calling upon people to understand the gravity of the situation that we're in and to join the transition movement, to start thinking through how you return to the land, how do you have a community of people that you're starting to interact with and coalesce a solidity with, so that as the turbulence continues to rise, which is now inevitable, we can begin to have the capacity, like the Benedictines, because we formed community, to navigate through. Just because it's Passover, a closing image is from Genesis and Joseph and the Pharaoh and the dream of the Pharaoh, the 7 fat cows and then the 7 thin cows, and the thin cows ate the fat cows. It was that there was time of plenty, and then there was going to be a time of real famine. We are at the end of the 7 years of plenty. It's giving way to the time of real sorrows, and we have just enough time, I think about 24 to 36 months, to really take seriously building resilient community before I think the turbulence is going to get very, very heavy. And I think what we're seeing in Japan is just the foretaste of things to come. And so resilient community is where I'm putting almost all my time and attention.
That's a really intelligent choice. I think we had David Corton on not that long ago speaking in some way about building local economies, which is all really about local eating, local loving, local friendship and family, and building these tightly knit, survival-based, if you will, communities that are organic in nature. So it's an idea whose time has come. Let me ask you, before you leave, about your relationship with Gorbachev, who, of course, was, in power some years back, but he is still a man of great prominence. What of men like him who see the larger picture and have the ears of those in power, or I would imagine have some, what is he doing in light of all that you've been sharing? Because I know it's a shared perspective due to the work you both collaboratively do in the State of the World Forum.
Well, we've had a very long, very robust and dimensionalized friendship. I first met him at the end of 1991. In fact, I was the last foreigner to see him in his Kremlin office before he resigned on December 24th, 1991.
My.
And one of the things that I would note about Gorbachev is that he was a man of such strong moral courage. If you look at the history of his 6 years in office, particularly according to Alexander Yakovlev, who was on the Politburo and was one of his, was really the triumvirate, part of the triumvirate. It was Gorbachev, obviously, as president, Shevardnadze as the foreign minister, and Yakovlev as the major figure in the Politburo that really governed the Soviet Union during the Gorbachev years. And Yakovlev told me once that not once, when there was a situation of tension, when the KGB and the military were recommending to the president that he come down, as the Soviets had done from Stalin onwards, in a heavy-handed, murderous way, Gorbachev always said that true power is political power, where you work through your differences in a democratic and nonviolent way. And I learned deeply that lesson from him, that no matter what the tension, no matter how you're tempted to use violence, that if you think about it long enough, there's always a much more creative way to deal with the situation. And I must say that's in some ways informing me as I try to deal with climate change. At some point you realize that you can't there's no point in banging your head against the wall of trying to change interests that are now completely corrupted by Wall Street. But what is another creative way to do it? Well, you can join the transition movement. You can do what David Corton has suggested and start developing local economies. You can start to build communities to go off-grid. There's every crisis is laced with all kinds of opportunities. And I have never actually felt more abundant or optimistic in my entire life than all of a sudden when I realized that I don't have to try to change the system. What I have to do is try to change me.
Yes. How liberating, truly. That's wonderful.
Jim.
Saint
Benedict was right.
Yes, indeed. And make Benedictine as well. Listen, what is a website where people can learn more about both Wisdom University and this transition movement?
Well, Wisdom University, just go to www.wisdomuniversity.org. And for the transition movement, I think it's transitionmovement.org. But you can Google it, and a lot of sites will come up. It was started in England by a guy named Rob Hopkins about 10 years ago, and is now spreading all over the United States. And it's a very exciting, very, locally rooted movement.
Yes.
In Wisdom University, we've been starting what we call Wisdom Earth Circles, of bringing students and alumni and just interested people together around not just circles, but circles that are connected to the earth.
Indeed.
I think that's so important to engage in that sacred stewardship.
Would you come back onto the show on another occasion, and we can go into greater depth about that? I would love to.
Yeah.
Excellent. Jim Garrison, thank you so much for being a guest on today's show. We've run out of time. Let this not be a metaphor for what will happen in the way we take care of our earth and each other. I wish you all a happy Passover. This is Mitchell J. Rabin for A Better World. Thanks for joining us. Visit us at our website at www.abetterworld.net, and I look forward to seeing you all next week. Good night now.
You're listening to the